An original from Story Studio Network.
She's an innovator. He's a problem solver. And they don't rely solely on textbooks. They apply the science of generations of experience. Learn from grandparents who planted the seedlings, leaving a legacy for generations not yet imagined. They nurture nature and can only see the forest for the trees. This podcast series tells their story. Welcome to Forestry Uncut.
We turn now to the unprecedented wildfires on the move in Canada.
More than 16,000 Nova Scotians under evacuation orders.
I'm not sure you need to hear more than that. If you were anywhere in Canada, or really North America, in the spring of 2023, you'll remember the wildfires. And if you were in Nova Scotia, you'll no doubt remember how the flames invaded Halifax.
8 fire trucks passed us, and I said to my husband, turn around.
This fire has not been contained.
Crews fighting from the air and the ground as they battle the Tantalon fire.
Go.
The fire in Tantalon is still estimated about 788 hectares.
You couldn't do it again. If you repeated the Tantalon fire 100 times over, the 99 other times other than the one that actually occurred, you would never get through it without a fatality.
That's Matt Willett. He's a forester and has been a forester for the majority of his career. And he actually lives very close to where the Nova Scotia wildfires of 2023 happened.
This fire is not under control.
He and Stephen Moore and I sat down for over an hour unpacking those days of the fires.
It is a wind-driven fire.
The days that followed the evacuations.
We have nothing right now.
The states of emergency. All of it. And I want you to hear that conversation because it gets at the heart of this podcast, this uncut nature of the emotion we all have around fire, the raw reactions we have, the glaring blind spots we develop when too much emotion or tradition or misunderstanding takes over. So as Matt said, the silver lining is no humans died in those fires.
No injuries have been reported, but more than 16,000 people have been forced from their homes as of Monday afternoon.
I went out and fought that fire on the Thursday. Went out and, I was an officer on an engine in the community. And when I saw what we were driving through and what had transpired, I just cannot believe that there were not fatalities. And they're probably private, but I have heard many stories of rescues and of cases where people, were running for their lives, where their kids were running from their neighbor's house with ash burning their clothes as they were running to catch up to the car that was leaving. People's neighbors jumping into their cars because their cars were already on fire to get out of the community. It was Armageddon for them.
We have nothing. We're out shopping, trying to get toothbrushes.
What does that bring up for you? Just hearing all that news coverage.
Yeah, no, I can go back to the moments when those fires were occurring. I lived in Bedford, and the smoke column was coming over our home. And we had just previously moved from Tantalon. We lived in Westwood Hills, and I was a member of that fire department there. So I was in touch with the responding fire departments. I was talking to officers while they were on scene, and I just really wanted to go and jump into the fight. So and I knew a lot of the neighbors. I knew a lot of the people in the community, having lived there for 7 years. I was in touch with them and hearing some of those accounts for people, and the devastation that they felt and the loss that they felt when they knew or were hearing sort of anecdotally if their houses were there or not. There wasn't, it was hard for them to know. People worried about their pets and property and neighbors. Yeah.
Stephen, what about you? Like I can conjure the feeling in my body of how that anxious feeling.
I remember I was actually coming back up from the South Shore the day the fires kicked off. And I was driving back, and I lived not far in that summer. I wasn't living too far from Tantalent myself. And nobody really knew at that point what exactly was going on or where it was. So, I mean, I had pets at home by themselves. Had to drop my daughter off at a different place before I went back to try to get the animal. That was scary. I remember walking out of my place and I could see footsteps and ash on my patio. It was unnerving. So there's that. And honestly, it just, I don't know if it is the appropriate response, but it just makes me angry too. There's a lot about it that made me angry. But more so at that very moment when everything was kicking off, it was just honestly confusion and worry because nobody really knew what was going on. Nobody knew where it was spreading, where you needed to worry about, and even how to get away or not get caught in its path. And that's what comes back to mind for me.
Yeah, I remember we had taken the kids to Martinique Beach that morning because it was hot.
It was
right?
very
It
hot.
It was hot here. And we got all the way out there, and then it was windy, and cold at the beach, to the point where we set up for 10 minutes and then packed them back up and drove back home. And by the time we got home, the temperature had skyrocketed over 30 degrees, and we could see smoke over the entire city. And I just remember this feeling of, I think we've all touched on it a little bit, is like, where are we getting our information? Because I think in retrospect over the last year, what has become really clear to me about wildfires as we approach wildfire season again is the flow of information and who we're looking to for that information is so critical. And when we listen to those clips, what stood out for me, and I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking it, but is just how much the reporting was talking about how it made me feel like we were just at the mercy of the weather. All we could do was pray for rain. That was all we could do. And somehow I wonder if that subconsciously led to us all feeling much more helpless in terms of managing and understanding wildfires. Matt, does that make any sense? Like, we shouldn't just be praying for rain here.
No, that's a good point. When a fire, like the weather conditions of the day as you described them being so hot and so windy, and the relative humidity was so low, that's a condition called crossover condition. And that's where you'll get extreme fire behavior. And that term in the forestry world and wildland firefighting term is just to describe that they can't predict how it will react other than it will be in a very extreme, unpredictable fashion. So when you have a fire that's out of control and burning the type of fuels and the weather conditions that were present that day, it was just, the term perfect storm couldn't be, overstated. Like it was the perfect storm. And at that point, yeah, you're praying for rain because the energy that those fires were creating are self-sustaining and very, very hard to control. So when we look back on it and think, what could we have done other than not just pray for rain? Like that can't be the answer, right? At the end, there are things that you can do, to do preventative things to keep that type of energy from being created. And, from my perspective, being a forester and I've been a firefighter for 20 years. These two things merging, it's forest management is a way to mitigate that amount of energy being released. It's all about fuel. How much fuel is on the ground? If you can't mitigate the amount of fuel that's in the forest, especially in an urban forest interface, then when this happens again, you're going to get that type of energy release. So thinning forest, doing proper forest management, not only does it store carbon, not only does it make the forest grow healthy, but it also mitigates fire risk. And so all of those things that you just described, it's, there's, you go through the process of first reacting to it, but then as Stephen said, angry. Well, I can be angry about that too, because I know that there was no forest management and no forest management thought for these communities. And in fact, there was a moratorium on forest management around the community. And the community wanted that because, forestry was looked at through a lens of being negative, when in fact, forest management would have dramatically impacted the spread and energy that was released from that fire. So I go through all those things in my mind, repeatedly.
Well, people say, well, how are we going to clean these things up? How are we going to stop this in the future? You need a thriving forestry economy that's done well, that's done responsibly, that's done sustainably. But you need that to be able to step in, because unless there is that economic incentive, unless there's like a market-based tool that encourages people to do the work, taxpayers are going to be on the hook for it. And there's no reason for taxpayers to be on the hook for it. There are businesses out there who want to invest in the province, who want to see companies come here, companies in the forestry sector come here. And the more of these companies that are looking to do this work, the less risk there'll be, because they'll be buying up the low-grade wood, the low-quality wood, the stuff that's sitting in the forest right now. And so I get angry because, to Matt's point, the proactive stuff wasn't done. In fact, you were told in many of the areas surrounding where fires were, you couldn't do the work. And the reactive stuff was blaming boogeymen that weren't even the real cause of the problem.
What I love about what you just said, though, is, well, first of all, that it's not just the fire that's the fuel for the problem. It's the policy and the type of conversations we're having that can also fuel the problem at a macro level. Matt, I know this about you and I don't know the details, so I'm curious to hear from you firsthand. You looked at that wildfire situation from a very critical, I want to say, 3-dimensional perspective, and really helped solve some ground level problems as far as the cleanup goes. Can you explain a little bit about your thought process there and what the outcome was? Because I think it's brilliant.
Well, again, I knew some people that had been impacted and lost homes. And the week following the fire, I was speaking to one of these residents, and they were telling me about, that they had no ability to clean up their yards. Their yards were all burned and trees were there, and insurance wasn't going to cover it. And, they were very anxious about that. So I had thought that if I could create a project to help out the entire community and make a cooperative or collective project and use each land or each residential property and sort of create a large project out of it, then perhaps I could salvage that wood for them at no cost and sell it into the market. But that's a great idea, and we were successful in doing it, but it was very challenging. And to Stephen's point, I had to first approach industry. I needed a place to sell the product. And Freeman Lumber stepped up, and they were able to buy most of the wood that we had salvaged, and I was able to fund the project that way. But it doesn't end there. It goes to the sawmill. The sawmill makes sawdust. It makes chips. It produces bark. Where does that go? And does the end user in the province, are they able to use that product if it's been impacted by fire? So then we had to go down the line of the value chain. And there are not very many value chains left in the province that can take low-grade wood.
So we're sitting on the cusp of fire season again.
Started last week.
Started last week.
March 15th is the beginning of fire season.
Okay, so we're in fire season. It's going to happen again. With the backdrop of everything, I'm seeing, a release today that Shelburne County is activating new information systems, but we're still not hearing a lot about changes in terms of the forest management and the prevention and that kind of stuff that's needed. How are we going to do a better job this year when the forest fires and the wildfires happen at shifting the narrative? What is the one thing that we need to do better as those who communicate about forestry and the impact this year if we want to start changing the actual story? Matt, I'll start with you.
Well, I would say don't delete the clip that Stephen just said and play that back to the policymakers, because, I can give you a forest management plan for a fire safe community. And I can do that. I can design it. I can implement it. I can even supervise it. I have the resources to do that. But what I don't have is I don't have a place to sell the low grade wood that's going to come out of those forests when I essentially weed the garden to take out the fuel load. I have no place to sell it. I have no way to economically fund the project without subsidies, which don't exist, with a facility that doesn't exist to sell it to. So we don't want to we want to take the opportunity to educate policymakers and politicians and businesses that this is there, but we need policy change, and we need businesses to want to come to Nova Scotia to use the products that would then shift the forest management to mitigate the risk of fire. And it's not just about fire and release. It's also about carbon storage. Like, if you take low-grade wood out of the forest that's going to degrade and rot and dry out, that's releasing carbon onto itself. It releases the same amount of carbon as if it burned. So take that carbon out of the forest, create a product with it that is going to offset something that was made from, say, a fossil fuel product like plastic. You've offset carbon that way. Then you accelerate the growth of the trees that you leave behind. Carbon are largely just carbon. They store that carbon into a larger tree with no ladder fuels that will not allow the fire to get up into the crown. And then eventually you sustainably harvest those larger trees with the stored carbon, and you offset the building materials that are extremely carbon intensive, like concrete and steel, and then you store that carbon into a building. Well, you then actively manage that piece of ground again and grow more trees back in a fire-safe, carbon-smart, environmentally sustainable fashion. But I can't get in front of people to have them understand that that's my goal, and that is a key component, if not the component, of the forest industry, because, as Stephen said, uninformed activist groups that are actually hurting their own cause by taking the narrative and being listened to when professionals have a solution that are not being listened to. So the narrative, what can we do? We need more narratives like that we're doing here today. We need media. We need policymakers to understand that the solutions are right in front of them, and they're homegrown. As corny as that sounds, it's homegrown. We have a homegrown solution to all these problems, which all sort of interact with each other. They all help each other together.
You make it sound like so easy, which then just fuels the frustration even more, right?
Which is why Stephen said he's frustrated and angry. Yeah. The Acadian forest has a 300-year natural fire cycle. But the problem with that is that when that 300 years clicks over, you have and I'm not mincing words here, you are going to have a catastrophic stand replacing event that is going to reset the forest back to a state that it was 300 years ago. And if you build your homes in the Acadian forest and you don't want to manage it, this is what happened. This is what happened in Tantallon. And so when I heard this article talking about how we need to have old growth forest to protect us from fire, it is just in almost every humanly way possible categorically false. But because it came from a special interest group, it was picked up and disseminated to the general public as fact. And I'm hearing and I'm listening to it, and I'm like, that sounds so good, because that's what the public wants to hear, right? This is great. It's going to save us. It's going to save the animals. It's beautiful. I like the way it looks. And it's also going to protect me. And almost all parts of that statement were wrong. How am I going to respond to that? Like, no one's going to want to hear my side of that story, because I am a forester, which will be viewed as, Paul Bunyan, that, is only looking out for one thing. And it's just so far from the truth.
And Matt, I think you probably heard this as much as I did, but one of the things that I constantly heard is, well, because this has happened because forestry, plants monoculture crops. Well, first off, we don't plant monoculture. We plant a variety of softwood. Hardwood regrows more aggressively naturally. We don't need to worry about that as much. Hardwood, and people have this view that hardwood trees are somehow fireproof. It's silly. If there's enough fuel load in that forest, if there's enough forest fire fuel, that is going to burn. I mean, Matt, you showed me hardwood stands that burnt from root to tip, and so it's just, again, to the point, it's like the misinformation that's out there and the complete free reign it is given is there. And the other thing that's coming from all of this is that we're now getting this push to have the emissions from wildfires be counted towards the forestry sector's emissions. There are some groups who are actually calling for this, to say that when we're looking at the forestry space, the forest sector's emissions must include wildfire emissions. That's really messed up for a bunch of reasons. Like, first off, it's like telling a homeowner that because your house burnt, the greenhouse gases that emitted are your fault. But like, second, the point is that forestry was allowed to do its job, there would be less of this. Look at Finland. I mean, we met the Finns at our AGM. They harvest far more aggressively, they plant far more aggressively, they thin far more aggressively, and they have an incidence rate that I believe is 50 to 60 times less than ours. Mm-hmm. And so again, it's like this. It's a bunch of groups motivated by ideology driving it, and it's putting people's lives at risk. Like, we are so lucky that nobody died. I have no idea how it happened.
How there was not fatalities in that fire is a mystery that it's an unsolvable mystery.
So I'm so glad we got to hear all of that conversation, because beyond the fire and the science behind it and why things happened, you'll probably notice that Matt mentions a lot of what's been coming up through Forestry Uncut in the previous episodes so far. Now, when I hear wildfire, I also think no market for low-grade lumber. No market for the carbon capture solutions that are right there in front of us. No real regard for the fact that the forest will win every single time. So why don't we start to plan our communities, our cities, our economies with it in mind, instead of trying to pretend it's something that exists over there? Now my questions start to swirl again. What does it look like if we start to acknowledge and harness that full potential in the forest? Take all that natural energy, literally and figuratively, and convert it into a source for good growth and development.
Forestry Uncut is a podcast series produced by Story Studio Network for Forest, Nova Scotia, the largest, fastest-growing forestry organization in the province. Leave us a comment and a rating on the show, and be sure to share it with your network. You can follow Forest Nova Scotia on Facebook, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn. For more information about the work we do, or becoming a member, visit our website at forestns.ca. Forestry Uncut is hosted and written by Aaron Trafford. Our senior producer is Becky Coles. Jen Hudson is our field producer. Our editor and executive producer is Dave Trafford. I'm Mike Trutler.
Story Studio Network.
We know podcasts.